good souls of the planet and beyond to Paranormal Now. I'm your host, Alan B. Smith. Join us as we traverse the cosmic highway of paranormal portals and tantalizing turnoffs. Tonight's guests are Peter Robbins, Kevin D. Randle, and Mike Rogers. And we'll be doing a roundtable discussion tonight on the Phoenix Lights. So this is going to be a lot of fun for me because I haven't spent the time that I've wanted to on this topic, and I certainly know Mike Rogers hasn't as well, as we've had some conversations about that. So we're going to get the time in tonight. We're going to get a full 2 hours to really break this thing down. As we go, share your thoughts and experiences with us during or after the show on Facebook.com/ParanormalNowRadio, Instagram @ParanormalNow, Twitter @Paranormal_Now, and of course, join us in the KGRA chat room where you can send in your questions, and I will try my best to snag them and pull them in. Of course, later on in the show, in the last half an hour, you will have the chance to call in and ask tonight's guests your questions. So the call-in HD toll-free line sponsored by the Paranormal Radio app is 85-KGRA-LIVE. That's 855-472-5483. Listen for your cue to call in, pose your questions to the guest or myself, and then make sure you save that new Paranormal Radio app hotline number, 85-KGRA Live. Okay, so since we have three guests, I'm going to minimize their bios a bit here. So for all three of them, should you feel the need to add onto these bios, please do so. Mike Rogers, earlier in his career, was running logging crew, worked in contracting, developed a domestic tree service, and is best known as the foreman driving the truck for his crew, which included Travis Walton, and was an eyewitness to the Travis Walton abduction. Kevin Randle has written more than 125 books ranging from action-adventure to UFOs. He has interviewed at one time or another nearly every big name in the field to include the leaders of UFO organizations, witnesses to some of the most spectacular UFO sightings, and the researchers who have been doing the work of investigation. Among his more than 25 books about UFOs, he has written about the Roswell UFO case, the government attempts to hide information about UFOs, the Socorro UFO landing, which we've talked about on this show, and even 2 books about alien abductions. He retired from the Iowa National Guard in 2009 after more than 22 years that included active duty in the Army, active duty in the Air Force Reserve, and finally in the National Guard. He was a helicopter pilot in Vietnam and an intelligence officer in Iraq. When he runs out of things to do, he writes a blog at kevinrandle.blogspot.com. Peter Robbins is an investigative writer, author, and lecturer whose writing and research are focused on the subject of truly anomalous UFOs and their implications for humanity. He has appeared as a guest on and been consulted to numerous radio shows, television programs, and documentaries. Professional credits include editorial assistant on United Nations Secretary General's requested report, quote, for the establishment of a UN UFO department, end quote, an editorial assistant for Member of Parliament, the Honourable Brinsley Lepore Trench, Earl of Clancarty's requested paper for the House of Lords debate on UFOs. Robbins was a founding member of Bud Hopkins Intruders Foundation. He was an event coordinator for the Sci-Fi Channel's Alien Abduction Phenomena, a symposium organized to promote the release of the Steven Spielberg miniseries Taken. That was a good show. If you haven't caught it, go online and find it. And he was also writer, planner, and commentator for the Ultimate UFO and Ultimate Crop Circle DVD sets. Peter Robbins, NY.com. Gentlemen, welcome to the program.
Thank you.
Hello there.
All right. So we are all familiar with the Phoenix Lights event. I think the one factor that is a new equation here is Mike Rogers' hypothesis. So what I'd like to do is start with Mike and then have him lay out his hypothesis of the Phoenix Lights, and then we will move on from there. But very briefly, Kevin, if you could give us a summary in under 1 minute, what was the Phoenix Lights event?
It wasn't a single event. It was a series of sightings, some of them of a triangular-shaped craft, and others of lights hovering or moving across the sky and over Phoenix, Arizona. So it's a multiple events over a long time frame, several hours, on one night in 1997 with people observing the lights, videotaping the lights, seeing them through binoculars, seeing them through a telescope and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of stuff going on in Phoenix on this one night.
Okay, and this started March 13th. I think the first sighting was in Henderson, Nevada, correct? And it moved southeast from there?
There were sightings that began in the upper reaches of the northwestern side of Arizona, which is not all that far from Henderson, Arizona, or Henderson, Nevada. Mm-hmm. And the triangular-shaped objects moved down toward the Tucson area. So that's kind of a separate event, but then you have these light displays going on over Phoenix, and that kind of complicates the whole thing in trying to determine what it was. So you don't have a single event where you can come up with a single answer. You have a series of events that have a multiplicity of answers. And I said multiplicity because that's a neat word.
It is fun. It's triply off the tongue, doesn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so good. I think that's a good start. And what I'm going to play here now, look, there are a number of videos, and it's kind of hard to capture the video and audio, but I'm just going to play this for the audience just to set the tone and mood for those who may not be familiar. I mean, it is quite feasible, I think, or possible, that there are people out there that are not really familiar with this this happening. So I'm going to play this really quickly. These are eyewitnesses on camera at night, videotaping what they saw in the sky on that March 13th evening.
There's two side by side. This is slightly different.
There's another one. Oh, look. One, two. There's another one.
Wait, where?
There's another one, too.
Where?
Oh,
look at that.
there's another one.
No, we're just excited. We're not.
They keep coming.
Wait, I see. Whoa, look at them.
I got that one on video.
There's just 4 of them. Look at there's 3 of them all together.
I got the third one popping in.
There's one behind the chimney. One just flared up.
I got 4 of them. Major sighting here.
There's 5.
Oh!
Another one just showed up.
Whoa!
Maybe somebody's setting up lights.
Did you see that?
No, those are in the sky.
There's one underneath the house, too.
There's one behind the chimney.
Okay, come
We need to
look
go
at
to Pecos.
I can't see how this works. How does this work?
Holy
Oh, you got it too high.
shit.
Have you seen that before?
No.
That's weird.
They're lined up in a pattern, man. There's geometry behind this.
I can't even get
The-
this. I've never seen it. Look at that.
Man, this is...
What is this? What is
Let's
this?
see. Oh, there's 3 of them.
I know you can't see this for everybody listening, but if you can imagine what they're feeling and what they might be looking at this point in the video, there is like a delta shape of 5 lights in the sky. Now, I thought it was interesting that one of the eyewitnesses said something about it being possibly a light. And obviously we know the argument is from the government officially that these were flares. So, Mike, I'm going to let you take over from here. If you can present us start to finish with your hypothesis as to what happened that night, which I believe would at least explain away flares.
Well, the what you heard there in that audio clip was obvious. The people reacting to the second event, and what I witnessed was the real event, the big event, the event that was not flares. And basically, the Phoenix Lights started for me in Prescott, Arizona. I had gone there to visit a friend. I was on my way to Phoenix, and he wasn't there. So I just had this thought that I go up on this hill. It's actually a mountain, but I was able to drive to the top of it. And I needed to get some video of the Hale-Bopp comet. So from where I was standing on that hill, that mountaintop, I was looking kind of northwest, but the comet was very dim, and I still couldn't. I tried before, and I still couldn't get any real good video. It just turned out too dark. But right about the time I was getting ready to turn around and leave, I noticed a light coming up a little bit to the right, and it seemed to be coming up from the surface. Within a couple of seconds, there was 2 lights, and then 3, and so on. At one point, there was actually 7, just briefly, but then it went back to 6. And I didn't know what that was all about. But anyway, approaching, this thing looked like a chevron in shape. At least a wide chevron, not a sharp one, a wide one. And I watched it, and I got pretty excited, like most people did, because these lights were fairly bright. And at first I thought it might be a bunch of helicopters or something, but the lights seemed a little too bright for that. And as the thing got closer and higher in the sky, and it didn't go directly overhead, it went to my right to some extent, and it was headed southeast. And as it got a little higher in the sky and a little closer to me, I could see a definite shape in between the lights. It wasn't helicopters or anything else. It had a definite, a silhouette, a solid shape between the lights. A nighttime sky is only dark blue. It's not black. Now in Phoenix, it might be closer to black, but up on the hill, especially on the hilltop, which was a little over 7,000 feet high, the sky was dark blue, and I could clearly see the silhouette shape. Now the silhouette was quite dark, but it was definitely solid in between the lights, and the lights didn't seem to move much. They stayed relative to each other. And finally, after looking at it for just a little while, I thought, well, I need to know how big this thing is. I need to know how high it is. And I did something that I was used to doing, what's called snap triangulation, which is a method that's not quite exact. It's a fair estimation, but worlds better than guessing for sure. And without getting into any mathematical details, I was able to reasonably estimate its size, its elevation, and even its speed with the use of timing and a thing called an inclinometer, which measures angles. And just to get through it quickly here, I calculated its size at approximately 1/3 of a mile wide. It was about 5,000 feet above my position by the time it got up there fairly high, and it kept rising. And it was like 8,000 feet above the lower surface, and that lower surface was about 5,000 feet. And I calculated that out to about 13,000 feet above sea level and still rising. And its speed was between 60 and 70 miles per hour, although that speed seems slow from my basic perception. But the calculation said it was doing 65 to 70. Anyway, it rose even higher, and it seemed to be moving even faster after that. And before the thing disappeared from my sight, I decided I needed to get closer to it. I thought I might get some video of it, but I took off down the hill and chased after it. I went a little too fast for quite a while. I went down the freeway there, and I never did catch up to it, but I kind of kept it in sight. And when I got in the valley, I actually saw it passing over South Mountain. And then it was gone from sight entirely, and I was just too far away to do any more chase. I wasn't going to speed in the valley. But I went ahead and got a room. I was going to do that anyway, but I got a room. And the next morning, I went to a TV station. I think it was Channel 12. And they didn't have a whole lot for me, but they recommended that I call the National Weather Service, which I did. And a few days later, I think it was a Monday, in fact, I received a packet of wind charts and data. And then I knew that, well, you see, when I was on that hill, there was a stiff, cold breeze blowing on the back of my neck, and this thing was going south. And that got me to thinking, and I could see details that just made it look as though it was like a man-made object. It didn't seem like a big UFO. It seemed like it was something else. I didn't know what it was, and I still don't know what it was. But Once I got down, go ahead. Oh, once I got,
go ahead, Mike.
all right. Well, somebody keeps saying something like they're trying to interject a thought, but okay. Anyway, I got that information very shortly, and then I could see that it what I suspected that it was carried on the wind looked to be true, very much to be true. I also obtained wind documentation a little later on from the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, and when I got that, and just a few days later, I got Peter Davenport's UFO map, which he had then posted on the net, and altogether something came very, very clear. Whatever it was, I don't know, but it was in perfect alignment with the wind. Both this reverse S shape curving down across Arizona and the elevation and its speed. And altogether, that's an awful lot of precision, and which to me says it was carried on the wind. Now, we speculated on whether that might have been something like extraterrestrial, just deliberately doing so, but my problem with that is this. Extraterrestrials, at this point, aren't proven. And how can you speculate something? How can you have a supposition based on a supposition in order to say that extraterrestrials were traveling exactly the same direction, the same S-curving direction, the same speed, the same elevation? That would require a supposition based on a supposition. So my particular concept is that it was man-made. I don't know why, I don't know how, but that seems to be the case because that seems logical. Now, I've done an awful lot of research on this thing. In fact, this thing has kind of become my baby. I have spent an awful lot of time on this. I've collected everything there is to collect. In fact, I did 18 individual interviews on my own of witnesses, only a couple of which actually reported to Davenport or anyone else. And about 10 years after the event, I was in Boulder City, Nevada, which is just this side of Henderson, and I ran into two people, just coincidentally, who had seen the object, or at least they thought they saw the object. But the big difference between the two is this. Down in Phoenix, everybody thought it was huge. I mean, way bigger than it actually was. Anywhere from a third of a mile wide, which I had calculated, up to 8 miles wide. Which
so it's just a perception issue.
Yeah, just perception. But the thing is, they thought it was moving quite slowly. Everybody in Phoenix thought it was moving quite slowly. Now, these people in Henderson and Boulder City, about 4 altogether, thought it was the size of a 747, not a third of a mile wide, not 8 miles wide, but the size of a 747. In fact, the people in Boulder City told me they thought it was a B-2 bomber. And that's just slightly smaller than a 747. It's still a very large airplane. And, they knew that shape from the fact that those aircraft had been flying a few years earlier around there. And so that's what they called it. But the remarkable thing is nobody said it was moving very slowly. All 4 of those people said it was rocketing away, it was jetting away at what one of them called unbelievable speed, jet speed, blinding speed, one person said. And that just didn't jive with everything else. And so slowly over a period of time, I developed a concept. By taking everybody's idea and placing it all together and considering all the facts about it, I realized that the people in Henderson and Boulder City were seeing this object from 160 miles away. The object was never in the skies over Nevada. That just didn't happen. Everybody assumed it was like from Area 51, but the thing is this. The object apparently came out of the northwest, but in Arizona. It was never in Nevada. And when you start putting all that together, you realize that what they were seeing was extremely large, like I said, a third of a mile wide. And what they were seeing was something that looked like a B-2 bomber that looked very similar to this object. And because the mind automatically just perceives what seems to be instead of maybe what is, this thing that was a third of a mile wide suddenly became like the size of a B-2 bomber, which is 12 times smaller than the object actually was. And in doing so, it automatically appeared to be 12 times closer. And I've done up a map of that, which of course you don't have there, but it shows by projecting that size down to the 12 times smaller. It appeared to be right there in Nevada. And that's what everybody said. They thought it was in Nevada. They thought it was flying away from Nevada. They assumed it was coming from the northwest. Nobody saw it flying over the top of their head. They saw it flying away and at low altitude. And so what I came up with was something that I have phrased as virtual perception. And what that is, simply put, and I'll just say this very quickly, a definition of virtual perception is this: an object or scene in three-dimensional space and time that is perceived optically but differentially larger or smaller by the mind and can include other three-dimensional senses, usually involving an opposite differential of speed if a perception of objects in motion. Now, that's fairly simple, but people just thought that this thing was flying out of Nevada, and it wasn't. And
okay. So that much I can. I mean, that seems fairly easy to grasp.
Yeah.
But I know in the initial reports, it was seen, yes, in Henderson. But the first report I think came in at 8:16 p.m. to Newfork from a former police officer. Then in Paulden, 50 miles away, just a few minutes later, there was another report.
Yes, well, actually, the times it was actually seen from Henderson and Boulder City at about 5 minutes before 8 Arizona time. And it was seen like 10 or 15 minutes after that, in Paulden and wherever in Arizona. It was seen by several people, but the thing of it is, that time, myself, standing on that hill, I saw it rising up at about 5 after 8. So what you have there, nothing could possibly move that fast from Nevada to northern Arizona. I mean, that's 160 miles or more, and it just couldn't do that. It would be moving. It would have to be moving at like 900 miles an hour or something. Mm-hmm. And because of that, people like Lynn Catay had decided that it had to be some kind of a paradox, and she envisioned it being a parallel universe or something like that. And it is very strange. It does seem to be a paradox. The thing of it is, when you consider the fact that these people were seeing something that was already in Arizona, the times there make sense. And the size makes sense, and everything makes sense that way.
Well, so when you have witnesses in downtown Phoenix saying there was a craft that was moving extraordinarily slow, and at one point they believed it was hovering right over them.
Yes.
So what you're saying, it seems to me that the belief that it was traveling so fast was really just because of its size.
Well, no, that isn't it. Actually, it's a little bit more complicated. You see, virtual perception requires a differential of size. when a person sees something like 12 times, in their mind, they perceive something to be 12 times smaller than it actually is.
Mm-hmm.
The speed of the object is actually 12 times faster than it actually is. That is demonstrated very well by something as simple as cinematic technique. It used to be before digital technique in the movies. Things were done differently. A person viewing a giant castle on a hill isn't really seeing a giant castle on the hill in the movies. But they're seeing, what's that?
They're closer to the camera lens.
Yeah, well, what's happening is there's this thing that they take and paint a small realistic castle on glass and place it directly in front of the cinematography camera, and that makes it appear to be huge over on a distant hill. That's a kind of a simple thing, but it gives you an idea of what this thing was. And a way to understand the speed there is like, whenever cinematographers and what would you call them? Cinema illusionists, whenever they would film small replicas of ocean-going ships, they had a real problem with water. They could build a replica that looked very real, but the trouble is the water would look to be moving way too fast, and because of the cohesive size of water, the splashes, the drops of water looked to be way, way too large. And they had an awful lot of trouble with that for a long time. When they finally built larger replicas, they were able to get the water to look more real, and the water to be slowed down. And that worked a little better. Of course, now they have digital technique; they can literally do anything. But whenever anything is smaller like that, its speed, its actual speed looks very much faster. And that's what we're talking about here. The people in Henderson and Boulder City actually saw it jetting away, at least it seemed to be jetting away, because they were perceiving it 12 times smaller than the object they were actually looking at. And that made it look to be, in fact, 12 times its actual speed, or like 65 miles an hour, 70 miles. It's like 900 miles an hour. And these people in Paulden actually said that it covered, a 30-mile distance in like 2 minutes. Well, if you calculate that, you're talking 900 to 1,200 miles per hour.
Wait, so then, Mike, what's correct and what's not? Because, so I understand the idea that how our minds process something that looks to our mind it is smaller, right? And
right.
So our mind is telling us it's moving faster than it is.
Yes, that's right.
But then, in fact, if it did travel 50 miles, or at least according to eyewitnesses, if it traveled 50 miles in a few minutes, what does that tell us about the actual speed?
Well, everybody north of Prescott was actually seeing it by virtual perception. So they were all seeing the same speed phenomenon and the same reduced size. Mm-hmm. Down in Phoenix, however, everybody viewing it was very much closer. And because of that, this object, which was still 1/3 of a mile wide, regardless of anybody's individual perceptions of size, it was 1/3 of a mile a third of a mile wide, and it was so huge in their vision, in their perception, that it seemed to be creeping along. It seemed to be way, way bigger than it really was, and it seemed to be creeping along. In fact, hovering at times, and that also goes right into that formula.
If this were a daylight sighting, let's say, instead, do you think that those perceptions would be different? You think
they would be different, at least in some respects. But if they were virtual perceptions, so you would have a differential of size, mm-hmm. then you'd have that same situation with speed.
All right, Peter, are you there?
Yeah.
Okay, so what's your take on this so far? Does that make sense to you?
I am the one person here without a horse in this race. Mike, who I consider a dear friend, forwarded to me his extraordinarily detailed analysis of the situation at hand here. Kevin's work I was somewhat familiar with, but I reread it in preparation for this in an earlier show. Lynn Katai I have great respect for, and of course she was the person most associated with the story in terms of published work. And I can say absolutely definitively and without hesitation, I'm not sure what to think. I find, first of all, we're dealing with material that is so confounding to start with, especially from the view of somebody who may be tuning in this show who is not a major student of this subject. And having worked for so many years in this field, and knowing that what would be impossible, conventionally speaking, happens every day to individuals who have experiences in this area. I was thinking of another possible theory that I don't think anybody's going to like, and I mentioned it the last time Kevin and I and Mike were together. There's no precedent for this. I've never seen any reference to it as a theoretical construct. There's no case that has put this forward as a hypothesis. But here's first the descriptions of the changes in size, the perceived changes in size. We have to remember that a factor, certainly not a deciding factor, but a factor, has nothing to do with aliens or the paranormal or interdimensional reality or whatever the nature of these other intelligences is about. It has to do with the physiology of human shock. Tunnel vision, auditory exclusion, adrenaline and epinephrine dumps into the body, a feeling of drifting, of that it's very hard to accept what you're seeing because it challenges absolutely everything that you thought you knew. And if it's something that's particularly intimidating, the mind can be very kind at moments in high stress and put forward its own image in the place of what you're actually perceiving. That understood, if indeed this phenomena, this thing, this object, craft, what have we, had the ability to transform itself in size. Because from what I'm hearing here, both Kevin's research and Mike's findings, and certainly the accounts of witnesses that Lynn has included in her book and other researchers have put forward, I will grant that all of these people seem sincere in their descriptions. I'm going to make an educated guess that none of them came forth as a witness or gave an account because they were then given $100 or something. I don't think this has anything to do with personal gain. But if we're talking about a phenomena that can change sizes like that, we all know that we, human beings, at the highest technological classified military intelligence levels, are well ahead of where many people postulate we are. But this sounds like, to me, a manifestation of a technology that I'm completely having a problem connecting with humanity. Not that it's not possible. And I think that when Mike told us earlier that after reflection, after critical thinking, examining the evidence, I know him well enough to know that he is a serious person and he's smart. And he's got guts, too. You don't put forward a theory like this, thinking that people are going to flock to you and you're going to get new friends from it. Just the opposite. That his ultimate deduction is that it was man-made. I don't know if I agree with that. Let's just say, and again, there's no evidence, no theoretical reality, nothing I've ever heard from anybody in the field that I've been in for over 40 years that has anything to do with what I'm about to say. But let's just say that this is a highly advanced craft under intelligent control from parts unknown, coming or going with impunity under the guidance of other intelligences from another place, another dimension, another what have you. And yet, for the 100,000th time, somebody's coming into our atmosphere, and now well over low down, where human beings, population of the Earth, can see it. Somebody or command control made a conscious decision that they would come in that close for whatever reasons. And let's just say, they're reading their instruments, which I'm sure reflect things like wind and airspeed. And somebody on the crew says, I've got an idea. Just for a lark, let's try something out. I'm bored. Let's go at the exact speed of the wind and make sure that we don't slip away from it. Why? I'm not sure. Again, I'm bored. And then, after the fact, as we start to pick up the news broadcast and monitor how these humans are dealing with this story a decade, 2 decades, 3 decades later, in the media and on their broadcasts, see where it goes and see if we can learn anything new about the way that they perceive us at this point. Mm-hmm. And I think it's ludicrous hearing myself say it, but I demand the right to put forward.
Indeed you do, yeah.
A thought like that, because it's, we have a right to do it, and right now we're dealing with the unknown in the extreme, and it's anybody's guess. I respect Mike's work and his conclusions, certainly Kevin's as well, and Lynn's, and I'm damned if I know what's really going on here.
Well, before we continue on, Mike, is it fair to say that either this was something, if it's not extraterrestrial, something man-made here on Earth, the best aeronautical explanation you could come up with would be something that would float along this this airstream?
Right.
Okay. All right. So that's really interesting in itself, because I'm sure you've taken it to the next level and investigated dirigibles and what tech we actually have now that could possibly do something like that, right?
Right. Well, I have investigated in depth, and I've done an awful lot of projection, actually computer-based analysis, and it is not impossible to build something that floats in the air, filled with helium or some other lighter than air substance. Mm-hmm. And it's not impossible to build something that looks very real, looks exactly like the thing looked to most people, and do it very, very relatively cheap. Probably still take thousands of dollars and several people to involve, but it could, in order to say everything Peter just did about it being extraterrestrial, you really have to stack supposition on top of supposition on top of supposition. And extraterrestrials themselves are not actually proven. They're not even actually substantiated, not in any scientific way.
Well, a lot of people are shifting in their chairs right now, Mike.
I'm sure they are, and believe me, a lot of people despise me right now. But all I'm doing is putting, telling the truth as I see it. I'm trying very hard to be unbiased.
Well, unbiased is ideal. That is the way to go, and I have an enormous respect for you for doing that. And I do think that it's interesting that Peter Robbins speculated that perhaps they just decided, hey, let's do this path. Let's take this path. And Kevin, you've been investigating UFOs for a few years now. What have you seen from UFO behavior where they might make use of natural climatology, weather patterns, not climatology, just weather patterns, to either hide themselves or I don't know what. Is that something that's possible?
Well, obviously, it's possible that they could do that, but I would have a couple of other questions for Mike, and one of those would be: did you look at the winds aloft data because I know from studying the Roswell case, and I hesitate to bring that up because it usually goes off on a tangent, but we were gathering winds aloft data to research the idea that it was a Project Mogul balloon, and what I saw there was the winds at the surface. When you're standing there facing the winds at 20,000 feet could be blowing a lot harder and almost in an opposite direction. The other thing that struck me as Mike was talking there is that you're looking up into the sky at night. You have no frame of reference. So it's very difficult to determine A, the altitude, and B, the size of something. So Mike could be completely right that the people in Henderson thought the object was much closer and much smaller than it really was. So you've got a problem with perception there as well. So you have a lot of those things going on, and we have the information from witnesses all along, all throughout Arizona, starting up around Kingman, which is just south of Boulder City. I think it's 90 miles south of Boulder City, and Henderson is 15, 20 miles beyond that in Nevada. But you've got people talking about a triangular-shaped or a V-shaped object moving from that area down toward Tucson. And that doesn't seem to be related to the Phoenix lights. And I think when Peter was referring to people seeing the lights sort of hovering over Phoenix, you're talking about a separate event. And so we've got to look at all of that in an attempt to determine what was seen. So I think Mike makes some very good points about perception, and people tend to identify an ambiguous stimuli. That was what I did my PhD paper on, was the identification of ambiguous stimuli, which meant if you saw something in the sky, how did you interpret it? And your own belief structure influenced your interpretation of it, so that if you believed in alien creatures and alien visitation, you see a strange light in the sky, you interpret it in that realm. Something you can't identify, you would interpret it that way. If you believe in angels and ghosts, you might interpret it in that realm as well. So the belief structure comes into play as well. So you've got a lot of things going on here, especially when you've got something in the night sky moving from one area to another. So the perception of what you're seeing and how you interpret it comes into play as well. So Mike's theories are not completely outside the realm of possibility. They make a lot of sense. And if you're going to look at it from a sort of an unbiased point of view, any explanation that doesn't require the invention of interstellar flight is a preferred explanation, if that explanation fits all the facts.
Yeah.
Yes, it sure does.
Okay, well, let's clear the air. So, Mike, are you saying staying 100% non-biased? Do you not lean in any one direction at this point?
Well, I'm not 100% unbiased. I just try very hard to be unbiased, especially when it comes to decision making.
Well, as far as your assessment, where do you lean most strongly?
Where I heavily lean is towards man-made.
Mm-hmm.
And Peter was saying the aliens apparently could have been trying to see what we would do, trying to assess the way we looked at aliens, extraterrestrials. But what if the federal government built this thing to see the very same thing? And what if they built something that floated on the wind, and the purpose of that, the federal government purpose of that, was to see exactly how people would respond.
Gotcha. Okay.
If I may jump in quickly, just to say, with what I stated earlier, understood, of course I could be wrong. It's happened many times in the past. Of course, this could be a man-made phenomena, breathtakingly advanced one. And Kevin, of course, made a wonderful point in essentially Occam's razor and deductive reasoning. Always examine not just the most logical, expected possibility first, but the most mundane, the most earthbound, the most conventional. That's not nearly as sexy or exotic as, declaring something truly anomalous, like a number of our colleagues might do. I'm completely open on this, and if anything, this dialogue has made me want to learn more. When one balances the technical and the technological and information with the weather data, and then the overall, I think, very credible and heartfelt personal descriptions of individuals in a number of locations triangulating around the same phenomena. And let's remember, in a conventional auto accident, if there are 12 people who happen to be looking at that point in the road, absent-mindedly talking to somebody else or whatever, at the moment that two cars collide, when law enforcement personnel collect their accounts, they will all be somewhat different. Part of it, of course, is point of view and angle, but part of it is physiology of shock, predetermined attitude, and, your thoughts and beliefs leading up to that moment.
And I was just speaking with Ryan Sprague from Somewhere in the Skies. We were doing a recording for next week's show, and he and I, both living in New York City, have had in this city what I would describe as traumatic events occur, where we've been in situations where there was a fear that something either terrorist-related or something life-threatening is occurring. And we were sharing our experiences and our description of those experiences. And mine was somewhere around 2003, 2004. And I remember details from that experience that I don't normally remember from any other experience. And so what I'm saying, and it's obviously it's subjective, but I do believe it's supported by science, that when we experience something traumatic, memories are retained more deeply in our mind. And so when a witness is having a shocking experience, UFO or what have you, if they're saying that they see something with details, a body of the craft, I lean towards believing what they're saying because they're in a heightened sense of awareness. Am I off charts here on that, or what do you guys think?
Yes, you're off the charts.
Next question.
Let me explain. There's something called flashbulb memories, and what you're talking about is a flashbulb memory, something that is, for some reason, it catches in your mind. For whatever the reason is, you remember that. There was a psychologist teaching at a university. I think his name was Nessier, and when the Challenger exploded, he had his first-year students, fill out a form about that. There was like 6 questions on it. Where were you? What were you doing? How did you hear about it? What do you remember? When they became seniors, he gave them the same form and asked them the same questions, and they filled it out again. And then he compared the answers. And what he found was about 25% of them were very accurate. Mm-hmm. And about 25% of them weren't very accurate at all. And about 50% of them were a mixture of that. And what stuck in my mind from this experiment was one of the girls in the class had said that she had been at home when she had heard about it. Clearly she wasn't. She was in class. And she remembered her parents talking about it, all that. And when she looked at the form that she'd filled out 4 years earlier, she said, no, that can't be right. I don't remember that at all. So the mind, when you have these sort of traumatic experiences, can fill in details, can add details, and every time you kind of access the memory, you may subtly change it. And what we have to remember is there is no universal truth in how well memory works. Some people in these events are dead on. Some people are completely off base on it. So when you're looking at all of that, you have to remember that. So, I mean, I can tell you where I was when I heard the Challenger exploded. I can tell you where I was when I heard Kennedy was assassinated. And I hate to bring that up because it certainly dates me, because it happened in 1963, for those of you who do not remember history.
And you were 3 years old at the time.
No. Unfortunately, I think it was in, I must have been in 8th grade, I think I was.
Good Lord, you're still alive?
Yes, I am.
I was about that old. Yeah.
But the point is, I remember the announcement coming over the school's PA, and the principal said, "I don't want anybody cheering now, but our president has been assassinated." And I thought, what an insensitive, stupid thing to say. And I think my mother agreed with me on that one. But the real point is simply this: is that we have to remember that memory is not like a tape recorder. It's not like a video camera. It can be subtly altered. As we talk to people about the events that we may have experienced together, or we talk about the events, the traumatic events, all of those things can change subtly. So we have to remember that when we're dealing with UFO sightings, especially when we start going back into the hazy past. And the point simply is, and I hesitate to bring up Roswell again, but we were talking to people whose memories were 35, 40, 50 years old, and you have to be very careful when you're gathering that sort of data.
Right, and for those listening, Kevin in the 80s was really knee-deep, head-deep in the UFO investigation, as that was breaking and growing of a story. We need to go to a break. So I promise you, when we get back from the other side of this break, if you think we were off the charts this hour, wait till the second hour. This is Alan B. Smith, or Paranormal Now on KGRA Radio.
Your alternative talk radio contact, The Planet, KGRAradio.com.
Paranormal Now. This is your host, Alan B. Smith. And yes, I handed off several bags of money to get our guests to come back for the second hour. So here we are. We were just getting warmed up in the first hour. Thank you, everyone, for tuning in tonight. We appreciate all the chat room commentary. Unfortunately, I'm having trouble getting into the chat room at this moment. So I would encourage you, if you have questions for the guests, in the last half an hour, you call 85-KGRA Live, 855-472-5483. That's the Paranormal Radio app sponsored phone line, which we are very excited about. And little by little, we are getting more and more interest in the programming on KGRA, and we're getting calls. And this platform is growing. It's a really exciting time. So thank you again to our guests who have joined us. All right, Mike, if this was an airship dirigible of some sort, what, to your knowledge, because from what I understand, a typical altitude would be about 1,000 to 1,500 feet.
No, that's very bad misperception. You know, Air Force pilots, even though the Air Force won't admit to it, they reported to Peter Davenport, and he recorded those calls. And those pilots actually intercepted the object over Phoenix, and they said the elevation was around 9,000 feet above surface, which is about 10,300 feet average above sea level. And that's pretty high compared to all these other people. You know, we're talking about a lot of misperception here. And everybody on the ground pretty much thought that it was either right above their heads or like 1,500, 2,000 feet high at the most. And they were all wrong. You know, the people that were right up there with the object had a whole different concept, and they had altimeters. And the people on the ground, for instance, who thought it was moving very slowly, they were wrong too. You know, there were a few people moving on the highway speed, going the same direction as the object as it was moving past Casa Grande, and they had speedometers, and they could see that the object was moving just slightly faster than they were, which means its speed was around 70 to 80 miles an hour, and that's exactly right with the wind documentation. And that shows that people's perception was totally in line with this virtual reality that I've already talked about. You know, when something that big actually looks as big as it is, or even larger, it appears to be moving very, very slow.
Okay, now some of the witnesses mentioned that they had heard sounds like a whooshing or a wind type of sound.
That was in Henderson.
Okay, so
Paulden.
The reason I'm asking the question about the height is because it would seem to me that at a certain altitude you wouldn't hear certain sounds. And I reached out to some people in the dirigible airship aficionado community, and they're telling me that at 1,500, 1,000 plus feet, even if there is a release of the air valves, or if there's heavy winds pushing up against the craft, that an eyewitness wouldn't be able to hear that.
Well, there were several differences in that. For instance, Tony Ortega, who did an actual treatment, a skeptical treatment, on the Phoenix Lights first event, said he talked to a witness in right around there somewhere, Prescott area, and the witness said that he heard jet sounds. And I interviewed that same guy myself because I was in Prescott the very next day. I'd come back up to Phoenix, went back up to Prescott, and I started talking to people. And this same guy that apparently Tony Ortega had talked to that said he heard jet-like sounds, I said, well, there was more than one who heard the jet-like sounds of the wind, and it was coming from high overhead too, from the power lines, tall ponderosas, and other overhead structures. And when I told the guy that, he got really big eyes and started doubting his own self. You know, he heard the wind. He heard the wind like through the wires and stuff like that, which sounds an awful lot like jets. But everybody else said it didn't make any sound at all. But the thing of it was very high in the sky. And the people in Henderson, for instance, were 160 miles an hour, 160 miles away. How could they hear anything? But they heard rushing wind sounds. Well, the wind was blowing very hard in Henderson. Actually, on the surface, it wasn't so bad, but up where the object was, the wind, even it was blowing like 60, 70, 80 miles an hour up at the actual height of the object. But they never saw it at that height. They saw it from 160 miles away. What they heard was the wind, just like the people in Prescott. And people in Phoenix were very much closer, but they didn't hear a thing. And the thing of it is, if the thing was a dirigible, as you say, something that was man-made and filled with lighter-than-air substance, of course, it wouldn't make a sound. And that's what just about everybody who was close to it thought.
Well, you would have properties for directional purposes like fans. The dirigibles don't just float with the wind. They do have directional abilities. And
dirigibles do, and they're usually motorized too.
Right. And so wouldn't this unidentified flying object have some way to navigate aside from just following an airstream? Because
there's actually ways to create something, a large balloon that actually has no direction. You can still make it point in the right direction just by the way it's set up, just by the way it's created. It would automatically keep its nose to the direction it's going, just by the way it's constructed. I mean, it's hard to explain right now, but that's entirely possible.
Yeah. Can you remind us what's the highest altitude you think this thing could have been?
Well, the altitude that I calculated was, at the time that I actually made the snap triangulations calculations, was somewhere between 12 and 13,000 feet above sea level, and it went a little higher than that. But when you see air flowing over the mountains, say it was 13,000 feet flowing over the mountains, well, automatically would drop with the terrain. The air doesn't just stay up where it was; it would leave a vacuum down on the surface. The air actually flows down across. So, if you take the general elevation of the area around there, around Prescott, you've got somewhere. The object was somewhere around 8 or 9,000 feet above surface. And that's kind of an imaginary surface or an average surface. But down the valley, where the surface was considerably more easy to calculate, around 1,300 feet, the Air Force pilot said it was 9,000 feet above surface. And there were other pilots, private pilots, who came up with the same ideas.
I pose this question to all of you. This, assuming, let's just go with the idea that this could be a man-made object, that it could be powered by lighter than air. It has to take off. It has to get into this airstream, and then it has to decline. And where are the points of witnesses for the beginning and the end?
Well, nobody saw it short of Paulden. The people from Henderson, Boulder City, saw it 160 miles away. It's entirely possible that the people who built this thing, whether it was government or private, something like that can easily be launched from the ground, and it would rise in elevation until it got to a certain point. It would reach its neutral buoyancy. I've studied an awful lot about that subject, and I've come to some amazing conclusions, and it all fits in line. This object would reach neutral buoyancy somewhere around 14,000 feet, and then because of neutral buoyancy, it would stay with that particular wind layer, that particular pressure, all the way down past Casa Grande and further south. Even though in around Casa Grande, witnesses say it went dark, and some people said that they saw it going right over Tucson. But again, from my investigation, those people saw it the same way people in Henderson did. It was a very large object. They thought it was smaller and going and much closer. They perceived it approaching them, okay, and they thought it was going over Tucson, but only a couple of people actually have said that. In reality, there are people who actually observed it dark, going quite a ways southeast of Tucson. Like the calculation I've done is 24 miles to the southeast of Tucson, and curving more and more towards the southeast, and actually kind of clipped the corner of New Mexico and went into Old Mexico. And then from there, I don't know.
Can someone answer or speculate as to why no one saw this thing land or take off?
That's just it. No one saw it because it took off from someplace else and it didn't land. I think sometimes it is that simple.
Yeah, that's my take.
It didn't land.
Well, not anywhere that we
Not
saw.
there.
Yeah, it was
Sure.
dark. It was dark after Casa Grande.
Yeah.
And in the dark, nobody knows where it went.
Right, especially if they've turned those lights off, which I think they have the technology to do.
Turning lights on and off. I hope so.
Or the battery ran out. It was man-made.
Right. So, Kevin, do you think that this makes sense that it will be some sort of airship?
Not really. But there are a lot of other things going on. I kind of throw in with the people, where did it take off and where did it land? If it's an airship, you've got to have some kind of a base. Mm-hmm. That does not mean that I reject the idea that it was a terrestrially created craft. Area 51 isn't that far away from all of this up in Nevada. And so even though Mike says the people in Henderson witnessing it over Arizona, that does not mean that it did not fly over the Las Vegas area and just nobody spotted it. I was looking at the Mantell case, the National Guard pilot, Air Guard pilot who was killed chasing a UFO back in 1948. And when you begin to look at the times and distances of where the thing was spotted, it became clear to me that a lot of people didn't see anything until it was called to their attention. And that simply means that once it got out that people were looking at this sort of thing, or they were out looking for Hale Bopp, I guess it was. And so if it crosses over their city, they're not going to see it land because it's on its way somewhere else. So the fact that nobody saw it land or nobody saw it take off isn't a real problem. And it may be that people who saw it take off and saw it land knew what it was, and so they aren't involved in the conversation because they said, well, I didn't see what they're talking about. I saw something else, and I know what it was. So there's a lot of problems with trying to figure out, I guess, an answer for this thing when we don't have all the data. And as I pointed out earlier, we've got any number of sightings. I think there was a number of sightings over the Phoenix area where there were aircraft flying in formations. And that contributed to the confusion of this whole thing, not to mention the dropping of the flares on the ranges, the gunnery ranges associated with the Air Force bases, and all of that sort of thing comes into play here. So we've got a lot of people looking in a lot of different directions, giving a lot of different descriptions. And what Mike is focused on, and I think it's the important part of the whole thing, is this object moving from around Kingman down toward Tucson. Those are the sightings that are really interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, they are. You know, I want to say one thing about what you were just saying. You know, the people in Henderson and Boulder City were very few, just 4 altogether. And if this thing actually flew over Nevada, or anywhere in Nevada for that matter, you see, North Las Vegas, which was loaded with people walking on the sidewalks and stuff. I mean, who knows? Thousands of people, and in and around the entire southern Nevada area. Nobody saw it other than this handful of people.
Well, you don't know it. You only know the people who came forward or the people you found talking about it. And I've run into the same thing with the Socorro landing in 1964. There should have been a lot of people that saw it. And there's information that people saw it and actually reported to the police, but nobody went out to find the witnesses later on. And so that information is lost to research. In today's environment, I say, well, they were all playing with their cell phones. That's why they didn't see it. But, 1997, that doesn't really work for an explanation. But I think the whole thing is you've got to take into account where the people are and what they're doing and what they're looking for. And if you're in North Las Vegas, that's a pretty bright area, meaning there's a lot of light pollution.
Yes, but this object was very large, and it was lighted. And if it would have flown over Nevada, over to Las Vegas, which it certainly would have, coming out of the direction that everybody thought it did, people in Las Vegas, at least bunches of them, would have seen it, lighted and huge.
And the answer to that is simply they did, and they just never thought anything extraordinary. They weren't seeing anything extraordinary, so they didn't bother.
That's kind of a speculation. All the people in Arizona who saw it reported it, and lots of them did. Thousands.
But the difference is in Arizona, especially in the Phoenix area, you've got the news media involved in it right away, talking about all of this going on. So the people are out there. They're all looking. They're looking for Hale Bopp, from what I understand from looking at some of the witness testimony. They were looking for Hale Bopp when they spotted this thing.
But the news media was only involved in the second event. News media was not involved in the first event, and the first event is the real event, the one that wasn't flares. It hasn't been proven to be flares or anything like that.
All right, let's talk about that then. What is the difference between the first event and the second event?
Well, Kevin can probably sum that up better.
Well, it's clear that what happened in the second event, when you've got a lot of videotapes of the thing, is what the people were looking at were flares being dropped on the gunnery ranges. I think it's to the northwest of Phoenix. I think that's
the southwest.
Southwest of Phoenix. So
they're 70 miles away.
And one of the MUFON investigators on the case had gone to the actual locations where people were and said, where was the thing when you saw it? And they pointed out the directions. He took photographs of it. And when you played the videotapes and you knew where they were standing, you saw how their perceptions were skewed simply because of where they happened to be. And the flares being dropped, you could see them drop out of sight as they fell behind the mountains. And
behind the Australia mountains.
That's well established. So you've got that event, but you've got the important event, as I've said, is this object moving from northwestern Arizona down to southeastern Nevada. That's the important event, and that apparently took place before the flares were involved.
Mm-hmm. Peter, do you subscribe to the idea that the first event was not subscribe? Do you think it could be flares? Could it have been flares?
The evenness of the lights in some accounts makes me think no. If there was an unevenness, then that's another story. Yes, it's possible, of course, but I also have to temper it with my own predisposition toward, frankly, wanting it to be something more exotic and unusual. That said, yes, completely I can let that go, and it was a misinterpretation of conventional military or civilian air activity. But that, again, there were accounts that seemed very credible where everything was moving in strict unison.
Right. Some of these videos do seem to show a string of lights, and then little by little, one goes out and then another goes out. And I suppose from the skeptical point of view, that's proof of a flare.
Well, we have a lot of proof of flares. They have proof of flares coming and going. I mean, the Air Force came forward and said that it was the Maryland Air National Guard dropping flares, and they later came forward, like 8 years later, and they actually did a demonstration with the same type of flares in the same place, and Dr. Lynn actually said that was absurd because she was expecting them to perform the exact same situation as the Phoenix Lights that night, second event, and just because it wasn't exactly in the same alignment, the same configuration, she assumed that it was nonsense. They didn't prove anything, but what the Air Force did prove was that they were flares in the same place of the sky and the same size and everything else. And just because it wasn't in the same exact configuration didn't mean anything. But, believers will believe what they want to believe, and that's that. Believers basically, especially true believers, tend to ignore actual fact.
What are the chances that these are drones, early early drones that we just simply weren't aware of yet, and they were being tested.
Which, the first or the second event?
There's an original thought.
The first event. Because a drone could theoretically, you could keep them in formation, could you not?
Yeah, but the thing of it is, everybody saw a solid shape in between the lights. A huge solid shape.
That's the clincher.
How do you do that with drones?
Yeah. Kevin.
Yes.
Were you on the ground? Did you ever get a chance to talk to eyewitnesses in person?
I only talked to a couple of people, and one of them was Jim Kelly, who was an investigator of this, and I talked to a couple of people who he put me in touch with some police officers, and that event took place in October, so it's really not related to what we're talking to here. I looked at the documentation from various sources and the people who were involved in the investigations, and what the Air Force had to say and that sort of thing. I mean, if the Air Force tells me the sky is blue, I'm going to go out and look, even though I was a part of the Air Force at one time, when it relates to UFOs, because they had a habit of glomming on to the most ridiculous explanations. In the Levelland case back in 1957, which were people scattered all over the Levelland area of Texas reporting this object there, they decided it was ball lightning. And it made no difference that ball lightning is a very rare phenomenon. And in 1957, the scientists were still arguing whether ball lightning actually existed. And ball lightning is like 8 inches, 12 inches in diameter. So it clearly couldn't be the explanation. But if you go to the Air Force file today, it says it was the Levelland sightings were explained by ball lightning. So when the Air Force provides an explanation, I'm going to check it out to see if it makes any sense. And when you start talking about the flares around 10 p.m. over Phoenix, that makes sense based on the documentation, based on the video evidence, based on what the MUFON investigator came up with when he was looking at that sort of thing as well. He decided that it was clearly flares based on going to the locations, talking to the witnesses, having them point in the directions, and being able to orient all this to the videotapes that he had. And he had a number of videotapes, and his conclusion was that it was flares. I have no reason to doubt that conclusion for that part of the event. But what Mike's talking about is something completely different and clearly is not explainable by flares.
Right. Well, I'll just throw it out there again. I know that the CIA was developing drone technology leading up until this point in time. So I think that we can't rule that out either. I'm going to play this video. I just want to let the audience get a sense of the mindset of what was going on then and how the situation was handled and how things could have gotten very confusing for a lot of people.
He went to humorous and controversial lengths not to stir the pot. He held a news conference after the Phoenix Lights to announce the mystery had been solved.
And now I'll ask Officer Stein and his colleagues to escort the accused into the room so that we may all look upon the guilty party. Don't get him too close to me, please.
In the alien costume, the governor's chief of staff.
This just goes to show that you guys are entirely too serious.
So this is Fife Symington. He pulls out his chief of staff dressed as an alien to make a joke out of the situation.
Yes.
Yeah, and he's since changed his mind.
Peter, you're familiar with his story, correct?
I am, and I think that, frankly, it was one of the lowest, most condescending, sarcastic, insensitive actions of any leading political figure, a governor of a state, regarding the subject of UFOs since 1947. Mr. Symington apologized in so many words during an interview with journalist Leslie Kane 10 years later, but too little too late to go to the trouble of arranging this little farce when he himself had observed it, rather than do nothing or to have the courage to say, I saw something too, and I wonder what it was as well, is the lowest kind of activity. And I have just contempt for people who behave like that. It's a shame.
No redemption for him, Peter?
Well, again, he came forward and apologized 10 years later. My point is, it's one thing in a leadership position to say, I wonder what it was too, or I don't know what it was, or maybe we should have a committee to get to the bottom of it. But to go to the trouble to embarrass or belittle people who genuinely saw something. And now, wink, wink, nudge, nudge, flying saucers and little green men will have a little fun at your expense because the unknown makes me nervous or for whatever reason. Mm-hmm. People in leadership positions should be bigger than that. And here we have not only the governor of the state at the time, but yet one more witness to this phenomenon, whatever it was.
Now, I'm a little confused because I hear conflicting reports about John McCain. Do you guys think that he did the right thing? That he did enough? Did his inquiries into this event as requested by his constituents?
I don't know, quite honestly, the extent to which his inquiries went, and we have to remember whatever was put forward as what he did was what was put forward. He may have dug deeper, and we will never be able to know that for any number of reasons, or not. I do have it on good authority that he had a credible sighting as a fighter pilot many, many years before that, and understanding and knowing the way the game worked, that real men and real fighter pilots don't report flying saucers, and the fact that he had a complex relationship with his father, a commanding admiral in the Army, and some issues there in the Navy. I certainly wouldn't blame him if he never said a word about that, but we don't know the extent that he looked into this. We only know what was put forward as the extent that he put into it.
Well, we do know that Barwood called for an investigation, an official investigation funded by the Arizona government, and that was one thing. In fact, she was the brunt of Simonton's, sarcasm, and it kind of ruined her career, really. But there really was never an actual official investigation. It never happened. And so, like Peter said, we'll never know a lot of that.
Well, there's always something that's bothered me about this because of all the self-styled UFO investigators out there. And if I wanted to investigate the Phoenix Light in an official capacity, but not want anybody to know it, I show up as an investigator for NICAP or MUFON or just a private investigator who's interested in UFOs. I'm feeding all the information back into my government agency, whatever that agency may be, to get to the bottom of this whole thing. So there may have been an official investigation, but it was a covert one, and we don't know that either. And by the way, that's just speculation on my part on the way you could do that. If I was running it and I didn't want anybody to know what I was doing, that's exactly what I would do, is have some guy show up pretending to be a unofficial civilian investigator and gather all the data that I possibly could.
Yes, but what would be the purpose of that? I mean, if there was an in-depth investigation by the government or whoever, and then they just didn't say anything about it, well, what in the world would be the purpose?
Because information is power, knowledge is power. And you have information. Why? You don't need to share it. I mean, they're looking for something specifically, and this may be one of the attitudes that they take. We don't need the general public or people to know what we're doing. We don't want the press to know what we're doing in gathering this data, because that opens up a whole lot of other doors. Look at the problems they've run into since we learned about the ATIP program. They opened that door, and look what's going on there. And I think, if you want to keep it undercover, you want to keep it covert, that's a way to run that kind of an investigation, which is not to say that they did. I'm just saying that's the way they could have done it if they wanted to.
Well, in my thinking, since I believe that it was a government thing or a private construction, and especially if it was government, obviously they did it for a reason. And the reason seems to be to find out people's reaction. And therefore they wouldn't tell anybody. It would be covert, and all that information would be just for their purposes.
All right, if you have a question for Peter Robbins, Kevin D. Randle, or Mike Rogers, you can call in now. The lines are open at 85-KGRA Live, 855-472-5483. So Fife Symington did something that was, I would call manipulative. And we also found out that the city manager's office released a memo in May, and it said a check of police department reports shows that there were fewer than 5 citizen calls about these lights. Since the city does not have resources or expertise to investigate the source of lights, such as those reported, we depend on the United States Air Force to investigate all such matters. But the first aspect of that is clearly a lie, because even Fife Symington had earlier on, and reports from the actual police station said that they were overwhelmed with phone calls. Is this normal procedure for these types of events, or was this a small town that just was, a small city that was overwhelmed?
Well, if you look back at the history of UFOs, and I'll bring up Levelland once again, because the Air Force got into a big argument with Don Kehoe, the civilian NICAP organization, about that. Kehoe said there were 9 witnesses. The Air Force said, no, there was only 3, because if the Air Force didn't talk to them, the witnesses didn't exist. Their own records showed at least a half a dozen witnesses, and I found witnesses at 13 separate locations around Levelland that had called in or had been reported to the various authorities. So Kehoe was wrong. He had too few. The Air Force lied about it because they knew there were more than 3 witnesses. So the answer is, yeah, there were probably a lot of phone calls to the police department, but they belittle it by saying, well, there were only a couple of phone calls about lights in the sky, and we don't do that. If you called the Air Force in that time frame, they would say, we don't investigate these things anymore. If you feel threatened, call your local law enforcement agencies for it. So everybody's passing the buck around there. Nobody's really looking at it as far as we can tell. There's no overt research into UFOs being done in an official capacity in 1997.
Well, there is very definite information compiled by Peter Davenport, National UFO Reporting Center, and a lot of people called him and reported in one way or another. But the truth is, what they're saying is fewer than has been reported, fewer than has been speculated. In actuality, from all the data I compiled, fewer than 100 people actually reported on the first event, all the way from Nevada to as far as it disappeared somewhere around Tucson. Fewer than 100 people, and that included the 18 people that I personally interviewed. That's not that many. They speculate there was 10,000 people who saw the Phoenix Lights. I think that's kind of high, especially since there are less than 100 people that actually reported to anybody.
Mm-hmm. Peter?
Yes.
If you had to look at this from your experience and your perspective, do you think that there was a mass hysteria going on, and perhaps that people sort of hyped up in their mind what actually happened? Do you think there's an emotional component to this?
It's funny. Wilhelm Reich, great scientist whose work I have studied for since I was a teenager. A simple statement he once made, which was evasion of the obvious. That is a very obvious thought, and it hadn't even occurred to me. Yes, it's possible. One sees something that we're cued to associate with a certain phenomena, a certain reality, a certain technology, mystery, and that mantra that is emblazoned on the famous X-Files poster, I want to believe, can click in and then be immediately reinforced by those around us who are seeing the same thing, aghast and wondering. I think it's very important that we remember that, for me, I was not there. It's amazing actually that you and I, Alan, are here with two colleagues who were and who saw part of this and who had their own immediate and then afterthoughts on what it might and might not be. Yes, it's possible. I kind of wish sometimes that I had the ability to be more glib about these things, or to come off as though I know the unknowable, as some of my more colorful colleagues seem to, and just give you a response filled with all kinds of particulars about the most exotic explanations I could think of.
Mm-hmm.
Again, this is hardly an articulate, exotic, smooth answer. I'm damned if I know. I am damned if I know, but you brought up a very good point there.
Well, who's familiar with Operation Snowbird?
You talking about the Maryland Air National Guard?
Yes.
Well, I'm a little bit familiar with it, yeah.
So, is it true that Snowbird is code for diversion? Is that where?
I don't know about that. I don't know about that at all.
Well, Kevin, you spent a lot of time.
Wasn't that came out in association with the MJ-12 documents?
I don't know where the origin of it is. I thought you might be more familiar with your military experience.
Well, there's lots and lots of different covert projects going on, or not necessarily covert as well. But I seem to remember that Snowbird was somehow linked to some kind of operation that dealt with with extraterrestrials, which is completely and totally bogus. I think the real Operation Snowbird was something very mundane, and I can't pull it up right now from the back of my mind where it is.
At the time, Maryland International Guard training had said that this was.
That makes perfect sense, because what are snowbirds? Those are people who flock to Arizona or New Mexico or Southern California in the winter. Okay. And live up in the colder areas of the United States. So Snowbird is somebody like that. So if the Maryland National Guard is going to Arizona for training, that makes perfect sense. And I know National Guard units deploy all the time to various locations for training purposes. So that wouldn't be unusual.
Can the military or National Guard pull off something like they scrambled instead, and then later said, "Oh no, this was a trained exercise"? Because so much is by the books in the military. Is that possible? They could pull something like that off?
You mean scramble aircraft and
then later say it was a planned guard training?
Oh, absolutely. They do that all the time. They can do that sort of thing. Look at again. I hesitate to bring up Roswell, but they announced they had a flying saucer, and 3 hours later say, "No, here's a weather balloon." That's what it was. It was a weather balloon. Here it is. So yeah, they can pivot quickly when they need to do that. When somebody has inadvertently compromised classified information, they can pivot quickly to cover up that inadvertent compromise.
Right. Okay.
But Alan,
yeah,
you aren't being clear about whether you're talking about the first event or the second event.
Well, my understanding is that they changed their story, and this was in regard to the first event, that this took place in that time period. And that's why I think, to me, it sounds like, assuming they did do that, there was a jet scrambling of some sort to interpret this, intercept this object. Does that make sense?
Well, according to the pilots, according to the recordings that Peter Davenport has, the pilots were scrambled to investigate this intruding huge object, and they intercepted it and realized it was one large object, and that it was 9,000 feet above surface over Phoenix, and that was certainly not moving at 400 miles per hour, which is what Tony Ortega said.
Right.
It was moving. They couldn't tell exactly how fast it was going, but certainly not 400 miles per hour. According to the wind, things on the wind. That's pretty much proven. It doesn't say what it was, but the wind alignment is very definitely a proven thing. And the wind says, that documentation says the wind was going somewhere between 60 and 90 miles per hour. And that's kind of along the lines of what these pilots said. And so whatever the reason was that they were the Air Force or whoever wouldn't admit to that, the pilots have testified to them being scrambled to investigate that large first event object.
Are there
The other thing you have to remember, you have multiple military units involved here.
Yes.
So that what the Maryland National Guard was doing at the base wasn't necessarily communicated to the other units there. There would have been somebody in the operations section for the base, somebody in the control tower, of course, knowing what was going on, or the command post, what was going on. But if you called the wrong unit and said, "You guys have anything up?" and they'd say, "No, we didn't have anybody flying," and they interpret that to mean that there were no military aircraft in the air at the time. But you have to look at each of the units, especially when you have a training base where you've got units coming in from a lot of different places for the purposes of military training. So you have a problem with the right hand not knowing what the left hand is doing kind of thing, that the units in there for training may not be communicating with the units stationed there on a permanent basis other than at the very highest level. So the guys at the lower level may not know anything about what's going on.
And again, we're talking about two separate events.
At least two separate events.
Yes.
Right. And so during the first event, if you're a layperson, you're looking up at the sky, is it possible to be disoriented and confused if jets were scrambled, and you could confuse either the shape or the lights that you think are a part of this object but may have been lights with other sources? I don't know. I'm imagining things overlapping because all you see is light against darkness.
Well, I would like to point out, I had an experience where I thought I saw a dome disc over our town. And I mean, the lights were oriented right and everything and it would just look so much like a dome disc. And then I heard the jet engines. And suddenly I realized it was an aircraft in a bank and a turn and a climb that gave me a misperception. So yeah, if you're standing on the ground looking up into the night sky and you're looking at lights, and you don't hear any sound associated with it, you can misperceive exactly what you're looking at.
Right, because some of these lights dissipated or began to glow again. And also it seemed that some of the lights would be moving separate from the perceived whole craft, right? So there's kind of a morphing, which could be a craft rotating, but it could also be another craft flying in the fore, right?
Well, again, you're talking about two separate events. The best documentation, separating the two. The first event was a large, solid object, as reported by all the people who reported. And the second event was a stationary, and it was like a mile wide over the Estrella Mountains, and that has been proven to be flares. And whenever you're talking about the Phoenix Lights, you have to constantly remember which event you're talking about. Now, there were a number of events, but there were two main events, the first event and the second event.
Right. So, Mike, when you hear people's description of a textured surface, how can that be if this is something that's floating so high?
But you can see an awful lot of detail. I mean, the people in Henderson saw this thing 160 miles away. And, they perceived it 12 times smaller and a lot faster, but they still saw the same details. They were able from 160 miles away to see the lights on the leading edge and the solid shape. And, that's a long ways away to be seeing something.
As far as UFO cases rank, Peter or Kevin, what do you think? Where does the Phoenix Lights first event fall? Would you put the Belgium event above this, below this, Roswell? What is the significance of this event?
It fits into, I guess, the whole history of UFOs. There was an event in Lubbock, Texas in 1951 where a lot of people saw lights in the sky. Carl Hart Jr. took photographs of the series of lights passing over his house back in 1951. Very interesting case. We don't have any explanation for that photograph, but we have explanations for some of the sightings. I think this kind of fits into that same sort of category. We have a number of witnesses who saw a lot of different things. Some of the sightings are explained, and some of them haven't been satisfactorily explained. So it fits into that, I guess, that whole catalog of UFO sightings. Is there anything that leads us directly to the extraterrestrial in the sighting? Absolutely not. Could it have been extraterrestrial? Absolutely. But we do not have any way to make that leap into the extraterrestrial because there was nothing extraordinary about the sightings or the descriptions that make us think that it was something of an alien nature. But it could well have been.
Do you think that we have been, outside of this event, visited by extraterrestrials?
I think the evidence, if you look at it in a dispassionate way, if you look at the totality of the evidence, if you're not diverted by the skeptical explanations that have been thrown out there or the debunking explanations been thrown out of there just to explain a sighting, and again, we have ball lightning from Levelland, I think the evidence is fairly persuasive that we have been visited. Do we have the absolute positive proof? Well, no, because if we had that, we wouldn't be having this discussion now. But I think the information kind of leads us in that direction, and I lean in that direction. I am biased toward the extraterrestrial, but I look at everything from a somewhat skeptical point of view. And is there evidence that takes me in a different direction? Is there something that says this sighting is explainable in the terrestrial, this sighting is a natural phenomenon, this sighting is a misperception of an aircraft? Absolutely. We got lots and lots of those because many, many people are not familiar what's in the night sky around them. I was in Grant, Wisconsin at the sheriff's office investigating a different series of sightings, and some guy called in and said, there's one landing in my backyard. And the deputy said, you want to go? And I said, absolutely. And we drove out there, and he points to this red light in the sky, and he said, look, that thing's landing in my backyard. It was a red light on a radio tower. It had only been there like 12 years. He just happened to notice that night, and it confounded him. We had another one where the guy was talking about the thing coming down. We went out, he had a sighting of the moon, and what was going on was there's a lot of lower hanging clouds, a broken sky, and the wind was pushing the clouds along, and it looked like this light was moving across the sky. It was the moon. So people misperceive things all the time. So you have to take all of that into consideration.
Absolutely. And I think that's why the work Mike has done is important, because understanding perception must be an integral part of a UFO investigator's toolkit, and understanding all aspects of how one could misunderstand something that they have seen. Peter, how significant are the Phoenix Lights for you, the first event?
I think very significant, whatever they are, because of what they may be. And I agree with Kevin in that I lean very heavily toward an extraterrestrial hypothesis as one of a number of unconventional hypotheses. There is a younger kind of contingent of up-and-coming ufologists who are more caught up in the wonderful work and theories of Jacques Vallée, and tend to look down at the extraterrestrial hypothesis. I think it's kind of funny in a way, because the ETH is almost the most conservative of the possibilities there.
It's ironic.
The question, in a way, was beautifully articulated by somebody whose recent passing has left a bomb hole, a bomb crater in the lives and some of us who love Stanton Friedman very much and considered him a good and true friend for decades, which is Stan had a way of boiling it down, and I'm paraphrasing, but ever so slightly by a word or two. The question is not Are UFOs machines of advanced origin from parts unknown under intelligent control, coming and going with impunity from the Earth? The question is, has one of them ever been? And the answer to that is an overwhelming yes. So yes, we are dealing with that as a reality of subject. Whether or not we can ever prove that Phoenix Lights fit into that category remains to be seen. And just one point of clarification on what Kevin said, that we don't have that definitive evidence. I believe we do have that evidence, but obviously the euphemism of we doesn't cover the four of us.
Sure.
Yeah, well, that's my big conundrum in all this. I definitely believe in UFOs, extraterrestrials. I mean,
you just don't.
What else? But the thing of it is, my view of the Phoenix Lights is so contrary to extraterrestrial that a whole lot of people now think of me as an idiot. You know, Peter Davenport thinks I'm an apostate.
Well,
and, my gosh. I mean, you know, the difference between that is like night and day. You know, here I am, a well-known believer, and I'm saying negative things that look negative about the Phoenix Lights. But all I'm doing is bringing reality to bear. That's all I'm doing.
Yeah, thanks.
The problem with the whole UFO field is you have to embrace everything.
Yes.
You don't dare say, no, this is a hoax, or this didn't happen, or this is an airplane. You don't dare say that. You have to embrace everything, or you get labeled as a debunker and a skeptic and all kinds of bad things.
That's why I haven't been getting much work lately.
Yeah. I'm sorry, guys. We're going to have to leave it right there. We've got like 30 seconds to wrap this up. So quick, Peter, what's coming up that you would like people to go and see you and support you?
The outstanding Exeter, New Hampshire UFO Conference and Festival coming up the Labor Day weekend, August 31st and September 1st. And for anybody attending the International UFO Congress, which picks up right as Exeter ends, but in Phoenix, I am very proud to say that a film that I have worked on for quite some time on the life and the circumstances surrounding what I contend is the murder of our first Secretary of Defense, James Vincent Forrestal, has made it to the finalists in the International UFO Congress Film Festival and will have its world premiere there in the first week of September.
That is fantastic. Kevin, what about yourself? What's going on?
Take a look at my blog at www.kevinrandle.blogspot.com. The latest book is called Encounter in the Desert. It's about the Socorro landing with a lot of new information on it. Buy the book, read it, put a review up on Amazon. Help me make an extra 25 cents.
There you go. And if you want more supportive material, supplementive material on that, you can actually listen to a Paranormal Now podcast of that same interview with Kevin on the Socorro event. Mike, how can people get in touch with you if they have questions?
Well, by email. I don't have a site, but they can contact me at mhrogers, no D, ROGERS, mhrogers70 @gmail.com. See, I'm not promoting a book. I'm just promoting the truth. I believe myself to be very unbiased, and I believe that's the biggest problem with mankind right now, bias.
All right. Well, that's let's leave it there. I think that's a nice place to end it. Thank you, gentlemen, for coming on tonight. I really do appreciate it.
Thank you.
My pleasure.
And to the audience joining us, thank you for coming around this roundtable discussion and becoming a little bit more enlightened, I hope, on this subject. I know I am. Join us next Tuesday with my interview with ufologist Ryan Sprague, and we'll be talking about the more human side to the alien abduction, UFO witness and experience. Next Tuesday, 8 to 10 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on KGRA, your official contact for the best in alternative talk radio. To find out more, just go to @ParanormalNow on Instagram. Join us next week and the week after that. And I want to say special thanks to Ray Saab, our space-time maverick and producer. Until next time, live in the mystery.